people, and welcome to the show. It is Wednesday night, and I am excited to be here with you. We've got lots to cover, lots of news going on both in Congress and in the country today. And so I am going to be covering the key topics for today, one of which is about H.R. 1 and H.R. 4, these congressional bills that have now been introduced into the Senate and are under consideration at the moment in the Senate. This is a very monumental moment in our history. There's a lot going on with that, and I want to sort of cover what those bills actually do and why, and kind of where the Senate is at the moment. The next thing I want to talk about is the tragic assassination of 8 people in Georgia last night. It happened, the news broke as I was recording last night's show. And so I didn't comment on it on last night, but obviously we've had a little bit of time to process a little bit more. And I want to talk about targeting of Asians for race-based hatred and discrimination. And what the source of that is and what we can do to stand by our AAPI, that is the acronym for Asian American Pacific Islander, and next steps in how we get our country back to the country we want it to be. And then, of course, I get your Q&A tonight. I hope you enjoyed the segment about international topics last night. There is increasing death and disintegration of Myanmar, but I will save that till next Tuesday's headlines. But there's still a lot going on internationally, so do pay attention to that. Before I get to the topics of the day, please make sure that you like, you follow, you subscribe, you share, you tell your friends, your family, your posse, anybody that you know that you influence to support the show, watching it on YouTube, on Patreon, and helping us expand the reach of the show. I really appreciate that. So let's get right to tonight's topics. Topic numero uno. Let's talk about H.R. 1 and H.R. 4. Now, before I get to all of that, I want you to understand the history, right? The South during Jim Crow was extreme in its suppression of Black voters. I'm sure you've heard tale of poll taxes and tests and all these things that they did to suppress Black votes. And they were extreme and they were egregious. And it was precisely because of those things that the civil rights movement began. And it really picked up steam because there was such terrorization of Black citizens. Even though the 14th Amendment that was passed right after the Civil War was meant to create citizenship, full citizenship in the freed slaves, the social interaction between white people and Black people absolutely did not reflect some sort of truth or understanding that Black people were going to be citizens, and certainly not citizens on the same footing as white people. That has been the history of the United States since this very experiment began. The civil rights movement was the first iteration of trying to correct things, but it is a continuing journey. And it is not a linear journey. It is 1 step up and 2 steps back, and jagged, and starts and stops, and advances and then slide backs. And we're, the last administration was a major backslide for the rights of Black people. This last election put so many things into stark contrast, because the thing was, up until this last former president, or the former guy, everybody believed that voting rights were settled and that blatant, in-your-face voter suppression was a thing of the past. But what happened is, when the Voting Rights Act was challenged to the Roberts Supreme Court in 2013 or 14. I want you to understand that the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, the previous one, was done under George W. Bush's administration. It passed with 90 votes in the Senate. It was not controversial at the time, in the early 2000s and mid-2000s, that protecting Black voters was necessary. And the Voting Rights Act that came out of the Civil Rights era was a set of provisions in which federal government would supervise the election rules of states to ensure that state legislatures didn't go out of their way to suppress Black votes, because they had done so in the past, right? So there were states and jurisdictions that were under what we call special scrutiny with respect to voting procedures and voting laws, and that they weren't allowed to just unilaterally change them without making sure that they did not disproportionately affect African American voters, because they knew that most of these laws were changed for the express intent of suppressing Black voters. And what happened was that Justice Roberts, who is truly one of the worst jurists in American history, and I'm going to get to that in more detail later, but trust me when I tell you that John Roberts is an abomination on our court. He's not the most controversial in terms of his behavior or his comportment, but when you think about some of the decisions that he has made, and you think about his role in what happened in the last administration, you can ask some very serious questions. Anywho, Roberts Court decides that the formula that was in the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was antiquated. They felt like so much advancement had taken place that restraint of racist intentions were no longer necessary, and that what was required was a modern, updated formula to establish whether or not a jurisdiction should have extra scrutiny. And of course, he knew at the time that he made that decision that the House and the Senate was in GOP control. So there was zero chance that a new formula would pass through Congress, because no way would Mitch McConnell let that happen. No way would Paul Ryan let that happen. So they just killed the protection that was in place without owning the fact that no protection would be put in place to replace it. So you kill what's there, you obviously open the floodgates to voter suppression, and that is exactly what happened. Right? So a whole bunch of jurisdictions started to engage in voter suppression. And most of those voter suppression procedures really were affecting our elections. That is how you got back-to-back GOP wins. What happened in 2020? What happened in 2020 was COVID. COVID happened in 2020. And because COVID happened in 2020, many people ended up voting by mail. And the reason that this is important is because people voted by mail who were not inclined to vote by mail in the past. People voted by mail who were not inclined to vote at all in the past. And granted, there was a whole interest in voting to vote out the occupant of the White House, but there was also plenty of excitement to keep in the occupant of the White House. What happened was that the typical mechanism that Blacks encountered when they voted were circumvented by vote by mail. The onerous ID requirements, the long lines, the under-resourced polling places. So what's the difference between Georgia when Stacey was on the ballot and Georgia the next year? Well, the work that Stacey Abrams did, for sure, to register more Democrats and get them more engaged. But let us not forget that many of those Democrats ended up voting by mail, so that the long lines that were typical of Georgia elections and that we saw in the primaries were not repeated in the general. Millions and millions of people voted by mail. And it was that vote by mail procedure circumvented all of these well thought out, well planned, well conceived voter suppression measures. And that is precisely why, as soon as this election was over, the GOP legislature of Georgia went right back to the table to recreate those long lines. Take away early voting, take away weekend voting, take away vote by mail, make Black people stand in line, and then criminalize people who give them food and water. You could not more clearly telegraph an intent to suppress Black votes than that, other than just saying we just don't want Black people to vote, right? So now HR 1 is the bill that puts in the new modern analysis of what jurisdictions should be under federal scrutiny. One that will pass Supreme Court muster. So that protection, that federal second look at voter laws is now back in place. That protection that Black people had, because it was always the southern states, and not just the southern states, but certainly that's where it started, where it was most obvious. Now we look at Arizona, we look at New Hampshire, we look at other GOP-controlled states, and I want to make something 100% clear. It is only GOP-controlled states that are doing this shit. Democratic-controlled districts don't do this. Democratic-controlled states don't do this. There is no accusation, and as far as I have been alive, there has never been an accusation that a democratically controlled legislature went out of its way to suppress Republican votes. It has never happened in my lifetime. So this is a one-way ratchet. This is not both sides. Okay? So let's get clear about that. So H.R. 1, the John Lewis Act, is it's like Voter Access Act or something like that's a VAA. That law reinstates a formula for federal intercession in the changing of voting laws and voting procedures so that the feds can nix changes that are clearly targeted at African Americans, like the 235 that have popped up since the 2020 election. The feds now have the authority to say, nope, not that, not that, not that. You're not doing that. Sorry, no purging, no, and no. Okay, that's one major component. The other major component is H.R. 4. H.R. 4 is less about targeted African Americans, right? H.R. 4 is more just about general standard procedure for federal elections. It does some amazing things. It makes for automatic voter participation. It guarantees no-fault absentee ballot voting. It has a uniform ID requirement and doesn't allow states to make up their own. It prohibits the kind of purging of voter rolls, which is always done in the dead of night without notice to voters, right? So they don't know that they got purged until it's too late. And it makes them jump through more hoops to get back onto the voter rolls. It also has some serious campaign finance provisions in it that help to block big, massive dark money buys. And I want you to understand how that dark money can work in a state like Florida. So in our state, we have big corporate interests who decide, let's say, an agricultural interest really wants to block an environmental protection provision that is being considered at the state legislature. What they do in our state is they just run a candidate. They pick a person and say, you're going to be our big ag candidate. And they just fund that candidate. The candidate basically just shows up. The entire campaign and the entire campaign funding structure is driven by the combination of the Florida Republican Party and that corporate interest. And they just make it so. There is literally bottomless pits of dark money that come in to back up that candidate because they're coming through the corporate entity. And they're coming through the Florida GOP, right? And so there's just this swirl of dark money. Of course, Democratic candidates cannot compete with that. Now, it's not to say that there isn't dark money that comes to Democratic candidates too. There is, but it's very rare. It's only in the true battleground districts, of which are only a handful in Florida, right? If it's solidly blue, the money ain't coming. If it's solidly red, the money ain't coming, right? That's something I'm hoping to change with my enterprise called Fight for Florida's Future. But long story short, this H.R. 4 has provisions in it that are going to clean up our elections, give us uniform election procedures for our federal elections across the country, protect the rights of voters, and give access. We want more people to vote because the more people who vote, the more the outcome is a reflection of the will of the people. And anybody who actually claims they believe in democracy ought to want that. I want that even if that outcome is not an outcome that I like. I have accepted many election results I don't like, including in my own elections. But they reflect the will of the majority of the people of the area. And the more people have their say, the better the outcome for the country, the more our democracy is honored and the vision of our founding fathers is brought to life. And so you need to understand what is in H.R. 1 and H.R. 4. We need both of them. It is not one or the other. We need both of them. Black voters need H.R. 1. All voters need H.R. 4. They are now in the Senate. And if you have a moment, go look up Senator Raphael Warnock's speech, his first as a senator. It's 22 minutes long. It is sheer perfection. It is brilliant. Because he's a pastor of one of the most influential churches in America, he had to learn how to give a sermon. Well, he gave one. And I think it was incredibly impactful. So do yourself a favor. Go look up that speech. Raphael Warnock on the floor of the Senate today. But all of this is now in the hands of the Senate. And Warnock's bottom line is, Protecting the vote is 60 times more important than protecting the filibuster. And he could not have said it more emphatically. He could not have made the point more brilliantly. I am incredibly proud of him. He is the best upgrade in the U.S. Senate, the best in my lifetime. I am deeply grateful that he is our senator from Georgia. Whatever little micron that I put in of effort I put in to see him to the Senate, I'm grateful I did. Thank you, Georgia, and thank you, God.
If you like what you just heard, you can find out so much more and hear so much more on my Patreon channel, patreon.com/Pam Keith FL. That's where you hear the rest of this discussion, and there's lots more to share.